Good evening, distinguished chair, fellow researchers and members of the audience. It is a privilege to present our study titled Understanding Youth Tax Compliance Behavior, the Role of Tax Awareness Drivers. Let me provide you a preamble to our study first. Tax awareness is not just about knowing the law, penalty, or procedure. It is about shaping the mindset. Let's go ahead. Allow me to set the context. Sri Lanka's tax to GDP ratio stood at only 13.5% in 2024, placing the country among the lowest revenue mobilization economies, indicating weakness in revenue mobilization and tax compliance. In response, the IMF-led reforms substantially widened the tax net. However, this expansion has provoked considerable backlash among the youth, a reaction shaped largely by misinformation and limited fiscal literacy. The concern is therefore clear. The youth constitute the future taxpayer base. There is a growing evidence to suggest that they may not be sufficiently familiar with the tax system, its rationale, or its broader societal role, circumstances that could possibly affect their tax compliance motivation. Turning to the existing literature, we observe that many of the empirical studies on tax compliance have concentrated on general tax-paying population, while the youth segment, those who will sustain the tax system in the coming decades, remains comparatively underexamined. Consequently, there is a limited understanding of how socio-economic conditions, demography, educational exposure, and drivers of tax awareness that shape youth tax compliance. It is precisely this gap that the present study seeks to address. Why it matters. The significance of this study inquiry rests on a simple but powerful proposition. Awareness drives voluntary compliance, and voluntary compliance is the foundation for long-term sustainability. Equally important, an informed youth population is better positioned to resist misinformation, to place reasoned trust in public institutions, and to hold government accountable, thereby strengthening both the fiscal capacity and the democratic fabric of the nation. Against this background, the present study explores how the different dimensions of youth tax awareness shape their motivation to comply with tax obligation. So, formally, objectives of the study are to explore how the different dimensions of youth tax awareness shape the tax compliance motivation, and to inform targeted education and communication strategies for inclusive revenue mobilization. Let's see a summary of theoretical base of the study and key literature as well. Then with that, let's move to the brief research methods applied in this paper. Research design, descriptive, correlational, and a quantitative research approach. Sampling and sample size, a multi-stage cluster sampling, applying Tracy-Morgan formula with 95% confidence level and a population proportion of 0.5. The formula-based size of the sample size was 2,460 units. It was taken as the effective sample. Once the data collection methodology is taken, the main collection method is survey, collection tool, self-administered questionnaire. This core instrument comprised 37 5-point Likert scale items to assess theoretically and empirically grounded marker dimensions of tax awareness, general awareness, procedural awareness, awareness of taxpayer, tax compliance motivation with 8 items, legal awareness 9 items, and awareness of taxpayer rights 4 items, and also the rest of the questionnaire included all the other information questions. Moving to analytical methods, exploratory factor analysis was conducted as a base model to discover the underlying structure and observed variables. The flow adapted EFA outlined in 7 steps in these slides: selection of measured variables, determining number of items per factor, sample size determination, data screening, and then model fitting procedures were completed. Accordingly, for this study, the final sample comprised 1,705 valid responses with 37 measured variables, 5 proposed latent factors with an average communality of 0.6. Following EFA-based refinement, the resulting measurement structure was validated using confirmatory factor analysis. Standard fit indices and cutoffs have been utilized and as shown here. Then the structural equation model using Smart PLS4 was estimated to achieve stated study objectives as detailed here. In SEM model validation, both measurement and the structural models are done applying all the prescribed standard criteria as shown in these slides. Let's move to the results now. For sample demography, socioeconomic information, and the descriptive statistics of the key observed items have been visualized here in these slides. So let's say gender, age distribution, residential information, education and tax education, descriptive statistics of key observed items all were explored. Then selected results of the exploratory factor analysis can be seen here, implying cone brush alpha for all the constructs are above 0.6 meeting the thresholds. Finally, EFA model is good fit satisfied the standard criteria, and EFA derived and CFA confirmed final measurement models are shown here. 6-factor solution representing 6 dimensions were statistically identified. As a preliminary validation for SEM, all the prescribed criteria fulfilled. Measurement model results are reported here. Estimated structural equation model is visualizing in this slide, and the results of the structural model presented here. So as shown here, standardized path coefficient indicated positive relationship from all predictors to TCM with varying magnitudes. In practical terms, the model suggests that taxpayer rights, awareness, and tax morale are the strongest predictors of youth tax compliance motivation, followed by legal awareness, while the trust in government and procedural awareness contribute only weakly. This indicates that the explanatory contribution to TCM is preliminary driven and TRP and TMR with legal awareness adding a smaller but meaningful increment. Based on these results, let's move to the discussion and conclusions now. The findings show a clear hierarchy among the predictors. Taxpayer rights, TPR, as the strongest awareness related to driver of TCM implies when youth understand their right as fair treatment, transparency, confidentiality, and the ability to seek redress, they may feel more respected and protected within the tax system, strengthening willingness to comply. This pattern supports a governance-centered view of compliance. Motivation is not only about knowing rules, but about believing the system treats taxpayers fairly and predictably. Secondly, tax morale as an influential indicates that internalized ethical norms and civic responsibility remain central to youth compliance motivation. Practically, even in environment where enforcement and procedures exist, a strong internal commitment to doing the right thing appears to materially raise compliance motivation. Legal awareness showed a positive but smaller effect. This suggests that knowing legal obligations and consequences contribute to compliance motivation, but it is not sufficient on its own to drive strong motivational change, especially compared to rights, awareness, and morale. One possible interpretation is that legal knowledge increases clarity and reduces uncertainty, but motivation increases more when youth feel the system is legitimate and ethically meaningful. Procedural awareness and trust in government were weak predictors in the structural model, but this does not mean procedures and trust are unimportant in reality. Rather, they contributed little incremental explanatory power of TPR, TMR, and LAW were considered. Two reasons could explain this shared variance and presence of indirect effect. What will be the theoretical and practical implications emerging from these conclusions? Let's brief now. Overall pattern, rights and fairness and morale, dominating over how to or procedural knowledge fits a broader behavioral institutional view of the compliance, which says voluntary compliance is strengthened by legitimacy, fairness, perceptions, and internal norms. In youth populations, this may be especially pronounced. Youth taxpayers often learn by experience and perceptions of being treated fairly can be more motivating than procedural details, which can be outsourced or learned later. Practically, the study suggests interventions aimed at improving youth tax compliance motivation should prioritize, firstly, right-focused taxpayer education, concerning clear communication of taxpayer protections, service standards, compliant appeal routes, and how fairness is ensured. Secondly, tax morale strengthening, inclusively civic education, linking taxes to visible public goods and community-based messaging that frames compliance as a shared social norm. Thirdly, legal awareness, reinforcement, simply and communicate key obligations, threshold, and consequences in youth-friendly formats. Procedural awareness remains useful for reducing unintentional non-compliance, finally, but its motivation and effect appears limited unless paired with legitimacy building measures such as rights, fairness, and morale. And then some references can be seen here, and we acknowledge financial support granted by Kamini Korea Foundation and OIDA ICMS collaboration. Thank you.